I was thinking about a talk I did quite a long time ago now for some young lads at a church football club in Castle Bromwich. It was in 2006, and it was in the months after the Football World Cup. And the talk was entitled, "Who is your hero?" It's very obvious when I explain why I entitled it like that, because in the World Cup, England's great hope, Wayne Rooney, had been sent off in our quarter-final defeat. So he'd let his country down. He'd let lots of his supporters down. And I also spoke about how in the final, one of France's greatest ever players, Zinedine Zidane, had also been sent off. So on the biggest stage, he had let his country down. And my point was that even your greatest earthly heroes will let you down, but there's one person who will never let you down, and he's Jesus Christ. He's the supreme hero who's worthy of the name. He's worth seeking, he's worth trusting, he's worth following, and he's worth imitating. Because that is what impressionable children tend to do, don't they? They find someone that they can look up to and imitate and follow them. A hero. And in a way, that's our subject tonight. We've already considered, haven't we, in the first chapter of this letter, that the Thessalonian church were themselves worthy to be imitated. We're told that they'd become a model to all the believers in Macedonia and Achaia, but the Thessalonians could only be models because they themselves had imitated the Lord Jesus and the other apostles. Now, in the first 12 verses of this chapter, Paul, if you like, is urging these believers not to slacken off. They're still very young in their faith, they're very impressionable, and there's a lot of difficulty that they have to live with, so they can't rest on their laurels. And what Paul is doing is urging them to continue to imitate what they have seen and heard, and the example that he and his co-workers have set them. Just have a look at these repeated phrases. Verse 1, "You know, brothers." Verse 2, "As you know." Verse 5, "You know." Verse 9, "Surely you remember." And then verse 11, "You know." So Paul is urging them to call to mind what things they already knew because they'd already seen them in his life and in his example. And it all culminates in verse 12, where Paul wants to encourage and comfort and urge them to live lives worthy of God. In other words, to live in keeping with the God who saved you, to live according to the values of heaven. So in other words, he's saying, look, imitate me as I have been imitating Christ. Look at my example of what it means to live out the Christian life, an example I lived out in your presence, and then do likewise. Now, I doubt Paul would have used the word hero like I used it, because he was a humble man. But he certainly wants them to follow his example, and by doing so, to pass it on, to continue to encourage others. And we're going to see what that looks like tonight. But just by way of background, if the Apostle Paul was to visit our church this evening with all the authority of an apostle, I suspect he wouldn't need to tell us to imitate him. I imagine we would be hanging off his every word and would be sitting at his feet and asking him question after question. But there were one or two reasons why this might not have been the case in Thessalonica. So, for example, it's hinted in verse 1 that Paul's reputation may have taken a hit because he'd been forced to abruptly cut short his stay in Thessalonica. Remember, he'd had to leave in the middle of the night because of persecution, violent persecution. And it's possible that there were some troublemakers around who were spreading this rumour that, well, you know, when the going gets tough, Paul just gets going and he scarpers. And his ministry and mission is just a failure. Which is perhaps why Paul says in verse 1, "You know, brothers, that our visit to you wasn't a failure." And also there were many other travelling teachers and philosophers and fine orators who knew exactly how to attract praise and to gain a reputation very quickly in secular Thessalonica. And compared to them, very obviously, Paul faded. because that wasn't what Paul was about, as we'll discover. But it's not hard, is it, to envisage a situation where Paul's enemies are relentlessly bad-mouthing him. Look how unimpressive he is. Look how bad a speaker he is. He's a failure. And it may have been that the Thessalonians were starting to be tempted to feel embarrassed by Paul and maybe think, we need to look elsewhere for our model. So Paul is writing in part to defend his apostleship, to defend his own conduct, but not simply for the sake of his reputation per se, but because he really loves these people and he wants them to benefit and learn from his example. He aspires for them to be living lives worthy of God. He can't be there in person. He longed to be, but he's been prevented. But he wants to remind them of how he lived and for them to learn and imitate and grow. And I'm just going to highlight 4 aspects of Paul's conduct, Paul's witness, that that we can learn from here. So here's the first, and it's boldness, not baldness. I don't know whether Paul had any hair, but boldness. In verse 2, Paul says, "We had previously suffered and been insulted in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in spite of strong opposition." And I think probably that Paul is underplaying it deliberately here. Remember what had actually happened in Philippi. Paul and Silas were there. They were wrongfully arrested. They were falsely accused. They weren't given a fair trial. They were brutally flogged, and then they were thrown into prison, and for good measure their feet were fastened in the stocks. And one commentator I read said that the stocks had more than 2 holes for the legs, which mean that your legs could be forced apart in such a way as to cause cramping and pain and discomfort. So this is the kind of thing that they'd experienced in Philippi. So when they were delivered by God and they were rescued and they were able to leave Philippi, you would think every human instinct would have been to lick their wounds, limp away quietly, lie low for a while, and maybe not talk about Jesus. And yet it's clear, isn't it? Paul and his friends didn't keep quiet about the Lord. Instead, it was out of the frying pan into the fire, into more hostility and persecution at Thessalonica. Paul says, "We dared to tell you his gospel in spite of strong opposition." So despite not knowing whether it would be Philippi over again, how their preaching was going to be received, Paul and the others were bold. They were daring. They didn't camouflage or hide the message. They weren't reticent. They didn't apologize for it. They weren't coy or embarrassed by it. Fear of reprisal didn't paralyze them. They went for it. Now, I suspect those kinds of things, embarrassment, reticence, fear, they're the kind of feelings you probably had and I've had when we've wanted to speak about Christ, or we've wanted to simply live our lives as Christians among unbelievers. It's hard. The gospel is such a radical counterculture message. It fundamentally challenges the people of our world, doesn't it? It says in 1 Corinthians that it's an offence to those who are perishing. So it's a dangerous message to hold to, and we can be afraid of its power, and we can be afraid of the potential backlash against it. But not so Paul and Paul's co-workers. They're bold, they're free, they take risks, they're open about who they are and what message they believe. But it's not self-confidence, because in themselves they probably felt far from bold. They were bearing the scars on their backs and probably on their feet of persecution at Philippi. I doubt they were looking for trouble. Their boldness was, Paul says, with the help of God. They were mindful of God sustaining them, filling them, helping them, guiding them. Perhaps if I quote and expand Peter's words in 1 Peter chapter 2, they bore up under unjust suffering and boldly shared and lived the gospel because they were conscious of God. As Paul says it in verse 6, we weren't looking for praise from men, so they didn't worry what people thought of them or what might potentially happen. And I think we can really persecute ourselves and cause trouble for ourselves, worrying about what might happen. But they weren't worried about that. They were always aware and always thinking of God and God's approval and God's endorsement. And they were supremely aware of God's glory and God's wider purposes and not their own glory. Now, what do people who are concerned with God's glory and not their own glory look like? Well, I'd like to suggest it's not always what we think. Because, you see, when we consider someone who's perhaps shy and awkward and reticent, to our human eyes, it seems like they're very humble and very self-effacing. And yet actually, behind such insecurities can often be, not always, but often, pride and selfishness. You know, I don't want to be ashamed. I don't want to look silly in front of others, which can often hold us back in our Christian lives. And it's a far cry from Paul's example and others in the Bible. I was thinking of David. Do you remember when the Ark of the Covenant returned to Jerusalem and David is full of joy and he leaps and he dances before the Lord, and we're told that his wife Michal sees him and despises him in her heart, and she has a go at him later. How undignified, how vulgar, how embarrassing. And I must confess, sometimes I hear those words echoing in my heart. But you see, David had just laid aside fear of men because he was so taken up with the Lord and the Lord's cause. And if he looked undignified before men, so be it. I think we should really pray to be delivered from seeking approval from men and women. I don't mean that we're not to care about people at all, because that's arrogance. But I mean that we should long for the boldness that Paul displays, to be so caught up in the Lord and in love with him that we're not really aware of ourselves, to have that boldness for him. You know, you and I have all sorts of things to contend with. And you may be someone who is naturally shy and reticent. You may have all sorts of anxieties and fears. You may have bad experiences from the past that plague you. And your Christian life is a constant battle against these inner constraints, these thorns in the flesh, obstacles that prevent you from being bold in your faith. And you fear being exposed and being ashamed. Now, I know that feeling well, but the important thing is not that I know it, but that the Lord knows that feeling, because he knows you and he loves you. And he would urge you tonight to not look to your very real fears, they are real, but to look to the greater reality of his mighty power and his enabling. There's a very old hymn, probably most of you won't know, but the first verse says, "Give to the wind thy fears, hope, and be undismayed. God hears thy sighs and counts thy tears. God shall lift up thy head." And I think when you're so caught up with God that there's no time for you, that's to be truly free, isn't it? That's what it would be like in heaven. But it'd be great if we could have a foretaste of that in our lives down here. So Paul has a boldness, a freedom in the Lord to share the gospel. Now, secondly, another feature of his life that we could imitate, genuineness. Now, I think that's a word. On my spell check, it came up as right. Genuineness. Another word is sincerity. You see, because Paul and his co-workers were caught up in the Lord and in the gospel, they weren't harbouring secret ambitions for their own advancement. Now, we've recently had party conference season. I must say I don't tend to watch it anymore. It is quite dull, but every leading politician delivering their keynote address at either the Labour or the Tory party conference will have marked in their notes or on their manuscript or on the auto cue a place in the speech where they need to stop and they expect applause or laughter or something like that. They've been trained how to speak and how to be crowd pleasing, how to get an ovation. And of course it's all for their own career advancement, so they get noticed. So they get that 2-minute slot on the 6 o'clock news. And as I said earlier, there were many travelling teachers and orators in first century Thessalonica who were a bit like that, who could use all the tricks of the trade to gain a following, to be crowd pleasers, perhaps to gain a financial advantage. And Paul and Silas and Timothy, these gospel co-workers, were so different. They were absolutely transparent and sincere and genuine in their motives. They say, the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. So this wasn't a made-up thing that they were trying to do to, they weren't trying to establish their own cult. This was real. Paul, of course, was a highly intelligent man and a highly educated man. And I guess if he'd really wanted to, he could have crafted an absolutely brilliant, profound speech that would have dazzled everyone and could have attracted him fame and fortune. But you see, Paul knew that behind a polished veneer, you can hide all sorts of things. And Paul didn't want to hide anything. He was open. He was transparent. He wasn't a spin doctor there to sort of try and manipulate people or rely on clever strategies. And neither did he wish to make himself the centre of the message by using fancy words and rhetorical flourishes. He never used flattery, verse 5 says. He didn't put a mask on. That's not talking about social distancing masks, by the way. Remember, Paul was writing this letter from Corinth, which was a very difficult place in which to minister. And remember what he said later when he wrote to the Corinthians. He said, when I came to you, brothers, I didn't come with eloquence or superior wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. So I think if we could summarise it, we would say it wasn't about Paul. It was all about Jesus Christ crucified. It wasn't about Paul and what he looked like in the slightest. And I think if every preacher, me included, if we had a little plaque on the pulpit that simply said, it's not about you, well, that would be really helpful, wouldn't it? Because I'm not the selling point of this message, and Paul was never the selling point. Christ was the core of his message. That's why Paul can go on to say, on the contrary, we speak as men approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We're not trying to please men, but God, who tests our hearts. Now, in those days, any public official had to be tested and approved for the post before they were commissioned. And really, a similar kind of thing happens today, whether you want to stand for Parliament or whatever it is. It happens in many walks of life. Lucy and I have got a tenant, finally, for our house. They're moving in on Wednesday. But part of the delay has been this credit check and income check and landlord reference. Now, of course, sometimes checks like that can reveal the unsuitability of the person. But other times it reveals their character, that they are substantial, that they can back up their promises, and they get a big green light. And Paul is a man who is bold, and he's operating confidently, partly because he's received a divine green light. He knows he's not preaching in his own authority. He's not a self-appointed man. He's been approved by God. Now, approved means to examine or to test. And again, that happens all the time in this world. But think of when God does it, the God who sees the heart. It's keener, it's more searching, in a way more frightening than anything we could imagine. Now, when it happened and how it happened exactly, we don't know. It's possible it may have been during the 3 years that Paul mentions in Galatians 1. After he'd been saved, he spent 3 years in Arabia. Doing what? We don't know. It may be that this was God's testing of Paul. But the point is, God had thoroughly tested Paul's faith and motives and had approved him, which is a remarkable thing. It's no wonder really that Paul could be so bold for the Lord and so open, because he had nothing to hide. Paul had been in God's courtroom, so to speak, and God had fully acquitted him and authorised him to be his ambassador. Now that is an amazing place to be in, isn't it, in your Christian life? You see, if you've got nothing to hide before God, well, you've got nothing to hide at all, have you? If you have a clear conscience before God, you have a clear conscience, full stop. You see, Christians can live double lives, can't they? And, our sin can catch us out. Now, sometimes our sin catches us out in public ways, but sometimes it's not in public ways, but privately. Unconfessed sin, it's a drain on the power of our gospel witness. The guilty conscience is a terrible affliction. Sin in our lives can really affect our boldness and our walk for the Lord. It's very hard to be bold for the Lord when you're trying to hide things from Him. Verse 4 speaks present tense of God who tests our hearts, which is just a little reminder to us that there's no hiding place from God. There's a strange contradiction that He is our hiding place. He's there to preserve us from trouble, but when we're trying to keep things from Him, there's no hiding place. God had approved Paul, but Paul didn't think, oh, I'm a free agent now, I can do what I want. He carried on abiding in Christ, knowing that the Lord continues to test those who are His. Paul was transparent. He was genuine and sincere, not just before men, but before God. Now, thirdly, verse 6, humility. The apostles could have lorded it over these new Christians. They could have imposed their authority, demanding hospitality and support. We're apostles, come on, you're just new Christians. Do this and do that for us, look after us. They could have thrown their weight around. But it was, in fact, the exact opposite. As apostles of Christ, we could have been a burden to you, but we were gentle among you, like a mother caring for her little children. Now, the word that's translated gentle is, in fact, in more manuscripts than not, to be rendered infants. So actually what Paul is saying is we were infants among you, which is a very unusual phrase. But the idea is of innocence. You see, infants are far more honest, aren't they, than adults. If they need the toilet, they'll let you know. If they're hungry, they'll let you know. If they're bored, they'll let you know. They can't help but let you know. Whether it's pride or insecurity, we tend to put on a front, don't we, to hide who we are. But not little infants, they just are. They're humble. They're unafraid to be real. And this is Paul and the apostles. No side, no hidden agenda, no underhand plans, no secret desire to control these Christians. They're innocent. Now, Paul very quickly shifts his metaphor because, of course, infants may well be innocent, but they're also helpless. So actually, they can be a burden, precisely because they're helpless. So then Paul very quickly shifts his metaphor and says that the apostles were also like a mother caring for her children. And I think any mother who's carried a child in her womb for nearly 9 months is going to be naturally and instinctively massively invested in that child's welfare. And she will be tender and she will be loving in her care. And this was the apostles. Remember, the Thessalonians were a very young church. They'd probably only been Christians for a year or so at this point. And as soon as they'd become Christians, they had been thrown into a war zone of persecution and hostility. And they knew very little. And they had many fears. But Paul and Silas and Timothy, all the way through, were loving and tender in their care. They patiently listened, and they would have answered questions, probably answered the same questions repeatedly, without getting tired or bored or sharp. Paul was a formidable intellect, but talking about very basic things was not beneath him. In fact, verse 8, we loved you so much that we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well, because you'd become so dear to us. So the average travelling teacher would rock into town, probably settle into the best accommodation they could find, while they dazzled people with their oratory, received popular acclaim, lots of patronage, and then they quickly move on to the next town. Rinse and repeat. Now, we know that the apostles also had to move on quickly, but it was because of persecution. It's abundantly clear that this wasn't their plan, that if possible, Paul had hoped to be there for the long haul. And for as long as he had been there, Paul had shared not only the gospel, but his life. He poured himself out for them. There was no disconnect between Paul's message and Paul's life. Paul was the sort of guy you could imagine calling in the middle of the night saying, the house is burning down, can you help? Or, my car's broken down, or my mum's just gone into hospital, I need someone to go and visit her, could you help? He was the sort of guy that nothing would have been too much for. He was a humble guy, an unassuming guy, a giving man. We already know, don't we, that because he was far too taken up with God to be worried about the praise of men, he was a humble man. But humility isn't just an attitude of the heart, it's a practical thing, isn't it? Humility doesn't worry about the messiness of people's lives. Humility isn't embarrassed or repulsed. Humility doesn't fear that my reputation might be tarnished if I go over there or see that person. Humility simply rolls up its sleeves and fully involves itself in the lives of others, regardless of the cost. Not arrogantly, but gently, tenderly, with care. That's what we see here. It's a beautiful picture. And then fourthly and finally, and very briefly, the final aspect is blamelessness. Verse 10, Paul says, "You're witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous, and blameless we were among you who believed." Now, there are a number of Old Testament saints who were called blameless, or as the older Bible translation says, perfect. Noah, Abraham, Job, David, and as we know full well, none of them were sinlessly perfect. So perhaps a more helpful word we could use to describe them was that they were men of integrity. They lived interconnected, undivided lives, inside and out, lives that were whole, wholly in sync, mind, heart, soul, body, words, actions, everything together, wholly united in being for God. They weren't perfect, but they were genuinely for the Lord. And really, this is what Paul is claiming here. As far as he, humanly speaking, knew, there could be no substantive accusations levelled against him. His conscience is clear, he's not hiding anything, he's living for God, he's an approved, God-authorised man for God. He's a righteous man. Now, quite apart from all the other things that we've already said about how Paul and the others conducted themselves, just consider verse 9. "Surely you remember, brothers, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden," there's that word again, "not to be a burden to anyone, while we preach the gospel of God to you." So Paul didn't want anyone to question his motives or the work of the gospel to be hindered. He was entitled to be supported by the Thessalonians because the labourer is worthy of his wage. Paul says that himself in 1 Timothy. But the question was, what if people thought he was deliberately living off others because he didn't want to work? What if people thought he was charging for the gospel message? Paul didn't want there to be any cause for such accusations, so he and the others work for a living. They were tent makers. They'd have probably set up some kind of ramshackle workshop where they would have worked and where they would have preached. It's likely that most of Paul's instruction and his gospel witness occurred in the workshop as people were interacting with him. So manual labour and gospel labour combined. It was an ideal opportunity for Paul to draw alongside these believers as individuals and corporately, to instruct them, to live alongside them, to help them. Now, Paul has already said he was like a mother in his tender care, but also now he invokes this other metaphor. He's a father figure. Verse 11, "We dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory." I mean, any father worth his salt wants his children to grow up physically, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. And any father will want to pass on to his children what he knows and to see them surpass him. It's what I want for my kids. And it's what Paul wanted for his spiritual children, for these men and women. So he gave himself to them. It wasn't just a case of do as I say, not as I do. He poured himself out for them. Now you see, you can hide, can't you, in a church congregation? You can sit at the back and hide. And you can put on a good show for an hour or so, maybe chat for 5 minutes afterwards. But there would have been no hiding place, would there, for Paul in his workshop, night and day. People would have caught him when he was tired, when he was distracted perhaps, when he was preoccupied trying to finish that bit of tent. He was there, he was available all the time. He was open, he was exposed. And over time, people would have seen if Paul had been tetchy and disinterested in others and perhaps lazy. Yet, clearly, he was none of these things. He was blameless. Night and day, and that would lead us to believe that he would rise before the dawn and he would continue to work after sunset, so going beyond the call of duty. These men were toiling. And the word toil is the same as the word that's used in chapter 1, verse 3, labour prompted by love. Toil, hard, back-breaking work. And yet it makes the point. Paul's saying, look, we're not here to exploit you. And all the way through his time in Thessalonica, the gospel wasn't just being proclaimed, the gospel was being lived out by these blameless men, these apostles, these men for God. And the point of all this, the point of bold, genuine, humble, blameless lives, well, it wasn't so everyone could say, oh, Paul, what a guy. Isn't Paul amazing? Let's give him a pay rise. Clearly not, because Paul, as we know, didn't care for the praise of men. Rather, it was so that the Thessalonians would imitate what they saw of Christ in Paul, that they would call back to their minds the Paul that had lived amongst them and would imitate how he lived. It's often true that over time, people tend to resemble the personality of their leader. And Paul wants these people to resemble him in his boldness, in his sincerity, in his humility, and in his righteous blamelessness. Why? So that they too might be living lives worthy of God, living according to the values of heaven, being the people that they've been called to be. That's what it's all about, really. It's about people who are growing up as Christians and learning and growing in grace. I think too often we can have a sort of I'm all right, Jack kind of attitude that, well, as long as I'm all right, I'm happy in the Lord. I don't really care about how anyone else is doing in the church because I'm doing well. And that's not a good attitude. I think it's a good thing if, as a church, as Christians, we long to see each other growing in the grace and the knowledge of the Lord. And it's a good thing if we realise the role that we can play, that we can have an influence for good on each other. That as we live for Christ, and perhaps some of us are doing really well at the moment, and we are growing and we are walking in step with the Lord, and that's great. But that can benefit others too, can't it? We can be inspiring examples for others to imitate. Pass it on. That's how it's always worked, really, through the history of the church, from the Apostle Paul and then the Apostle John and then Polycarp and some of the early church fathers, and on it's gone, all the way through to where we are today, a chain of Christians imitating older Christians. And here we are today. And I pray that that model may continue here, that we can be models of the faith, that we can be men and women who are really for God, living for Him, worthy of being imitated. So we'll leave it there for tonight, and next time we'll finish off the chapter if we can. But just remember those four things that Paul holds out to us, and may we be helped by the Holy Spirit to imitate what Paul shows us here. Amen.